Part 2: Division and Declaration of War. Though thought of as a second war of independence by the American public and a defense of maritime rights by various sailors and merchants, the War of 1812 caused a huge divide in the American political system. Between the Federalist Party based in the Northeast, this party supported closer ties with Britain and a strong central government. On the other hand, the Democratic-Republican Party, no connection to the one of today, based in the South and West, supported a weak central government and a stronger break with Britain, and encouraged the expansion into native land and the preservation of slavery. Some of the reasons the Republican Democrats wanted to go to war was to defend the rights of U.S. sailors and to avenge the Chesapeake Leopard affair. They also wished to stop the British support of Native American raids by giving the natives weapons. Though the British Army in Canada did not have the surplus weaponry, instead the Native Americans got their muskets from regular trade with the British. They wanted to threaten the North American base of supply for the Royal Navy as a bargaining chip to stop their grievances with them. Other politicians argued that it would return the balance of free and slave states after the Louisiana Purchase. Other people who supported the war were border businessmen who wanted to use the Great Lakes to help move their goods and trade them to various other settlements. On the other hand, people who did not want to go to war were anti-Catholics who did not want to annex Lower Canada, modern-day Quebec, due to its vast Catholic-believing population, believing it would be impossible to convert them to Protestantism. The Federalists didn't want the war to happen while the Republican Democrats did. This caused the war to be the most unpopular war in U.S. history. This includes the Vietnam War. This caused the amount of people to volunteer to drop steeply shortly after the beginning of the war, so the American government didn't get the numbers that Congress allowed them. Out of the 50,000 volunteers that Congress authorized for the war, the American Army only got 10,000 one-year volunteers. The main reason why the Federalists did not support the war was they thought this war was only to further the cause of the Republican Democrats to break ties with Britain. They were also worried that the war would cause North America to go into chaos, and that Napoleon would take advantage of this to conquer them. Another reason why they opposed the war is because they saw this as an offensive war for defensive reasons, saying that the Republican Democrats wanted to conquer Canada to stop British meddling in American trade and naval affairs, and denouncing it as a war of expansion other than a defense of rights, otherwise known as going a little too overboard. Quote, "We will give you millions for defense, but not a cent for the conquest of Canada, and not the 99th part of a cent for the extermination of its inhabitants." Others thought the war would come to nothing, such as James A. Bayard, who said, "No war of any duration will ever extort to this concession," when refuting the point that the war would stop British impressment of American sailors. The last reason why the Federalists opposed the war was out of fear of the future of the United States, morally, such as the Federalist anti-war clergy preached that war is the outward expression of God's displeasure and provided a corrupting influence on its citizenry, which made them less virtuous and posed a serious danger to the constitutional bonds of the Republic, and that armies were a-religious and repositories that transform law-abiding citizens into savages who corrupt the communities with distinct disrepute for these practices. The Federalists also argued that the war would disrupt the commerce and farming, as well as force burdensome taxation onto its population, along with extended unemployment and bureaucracy that encouraged smuggling. So the Federalists argued for limited peaceful dissent, tempered with prudence and channeled through committees of correspondence and public meetings. Those who supported these sentiments began to protest, most notably around New England. Although some of the protesters often expressed greater fear of conquest by the French alliances than from the war itself, this sentiment decreased sharply when in June 1812 James Madison was elected President of the United States. He pursued an aggressive agenda against the British, at one point sending a letter to Congress, not expressly asking for war, but Congress took it as such, and began to vote for 4 days in the House for war against the British. The results for the vote for war was 79 to 49, which is 61% in favor of war. The motion was passed on to the Senate, where it was voted 19 to 13, 59% in favor of war. And so on June 1st, 1812, the United States of America sent a declaration of war to the United Kingdom, thus beginning the War of 1812. On the other side of the Atlantic, just before the declaration of war, the British Prime Minister was assassinated, and his replacement wanted to improve relations with the United States. by repealing the Orders in Council, but the US was not aware of this, as at the time it took 3 weeks for messages to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Some of the pro-war generals believed that Canada would easily be conquered, as the American invaders would be seen as liberators, and the population would join them. And also, the colony of Canada was thinly populated and lightly defended. While the latter is true, Upper Canada, modern-day southern Ontario, was populated by loyalists who fled the American Revolutionary War and were absolutely hostile to the American invaders.